Imagine discovering that the person you trusted most, your partner, was living a double life. Now picture this. You find out about their affair, but that's just the beginning. What if everything you thought you knew about them was a lie, a secret so dark it could destroy everything? This isn't just a story of betrayal, it's a story of murder, money, and a web of lies so twisted that even the truth might not set you free. Stay tuned to uncover the shocking truth behind a scandal that will leave you questioning how well you really know the ones closest to you. It was a day that should have been filled with nothing but relief and joy. Janet stood in front of their friends and family, smiling as she held up the envelope from her husband's recent medical checkup. "A clean bill of health," she said, her voice a little too bright, almost rehearsed. The room filled with a mix of congratulations and knowing glances. For the past few months, the family had been worried. Her husband, Mark, had been feeling off, tired, stressed, distant. He'd been avoiding the doctor, claiming he was too busy. But today, the results were in. No major health problems, no reason for concern. Janet's heart swelled with relief. This was the news she had been hoping for. But as she spoke, something in her tone wasn't quite right. A flicker of doubt passed across her face, unnoticed by most, but not by her closest friends. Her husband, Mark, stood beside her, his usual smug smile plastered on his face, accepting the praise. It seemed like the perfect moment. Everything was going according to plan until Janet dropped the bombshell. "Mark's clean bill of health," she repeated, her voice steady, but now her eyes locked on him. She paused for a moment, letting the tension build. "But not everything's as clean as it seems." The room fell silent. Everyone turned to her, confused. What was she talking about? Was there something else? Then, with a cold, almost eerie calmness, Janet continued, "Mark's been having an affair with the nurse." Her words hit like a slap, each one harder than the last. Gasps of shock filled the room. People exchanged glances, unsure of what to believe. Mark, standing there beside his wife, looked momentarily frozen. The smirk that usually never left his face quickly faded into something else, something more defensive, almost guilty. Janet's eyes didn't leave him. There was no turning back now. She hadn't planned on revealing the affair like this, but the hurt, the anger, it had built up over months of silent betrayal. The affair had been going on for longer than she'd realized, and the worst part was that it had been with someone Mark had trusted. The nurse, the one who'd helped him through his medical checkups, was now the woman he'd fallen for. Janet had found out in the most unexpected way. An accidental phone call, a name left in his messages, a trail of lies that couldn't be ignored any longer. Mark opened his mouth, but no words came out. The look of shock on his face was real, but so was the guilt that quickly followed. Janet's heart raced, but she stood firm, almost cold, as if the shock had already passed her by. She had been betrayed, but she wasn't done. Not yet. And just when she thought she might lose control of the situation, the twist came, one that neither of them could have seen coming. The phone rang. A call came in, the kind no one ever wants to get. Janet answered it on instinct, still staring at Mark, her hand trembling slightly. The voice on the other end was calm but urgent. "Janet, it's about the nurse. Something's happened. She's dead." The room went completely still. All eyes shifted back to Janet, who stood frozen, the phone still pressed against her ear. The nurse, dead? Was it an accident? A health emergency? Janet's mind raced, but the words she had just spoken seemed to echo in her ears. The affair, the nurse, and now, this. What did it all mean? Why now? Was Mark involved? The blood drained from her face, but her grip on the phone tightened. The police were on their way. They needed answers. As the weight of the news settled in, Janet felt like she was standing in the middle of a storm. Her world, which had been rocked by the revelation of the affair, was now shaken to its core with the news of the murder. Was this somehow connected? Had Mark's betrayal led to something darker? The questions flooded her mind faster than she could process them, and she realized with a chilling certainty that this wasn't going to be an ordinary day. It was just the beginning. The news about the nurse's death hit Janet like a punch to the gut. Her thoughts were racing, trying to make sense of everything, but there was only one thing she knew for sure. Nothing made sense anymore. The call had been brief. The nurse had been found dead under suspicious circumstances, and the police were already on their way to investigate. Janet's hands shook as she hung up the phone, still standing in the middle of the room, the eyes of their friends and family on her. She couldn't find the words. How could she explain what had just happened? How could she make them understand the overwhelming weight of everything she'd just learned? Mark still hadn't said a word. He looked like he was in shock, his face pale and drained of all color. Janet could see the guilt in his eyes, but there was also fear, a fear that wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was something darker, something that had nothing to do with the emotional damage he'd caused her. She could feel the tension rising, the air thick with unspoken questions. "Where were you last night?" Janet asked, her voice low but cutting. She couldn't hold back anymore. It was as if the floodgates had opened and she couldn't stop herself from pushing for answers. Mark's eyes flickered to the door, his usual arrogance replaced with unease. He wasn't prepared for this. He wasn't prepared for her to find out about the affair. And now, the murder. I don't know," Mark stammered, clearly struggling to come up with an answer. "I was at home, Janet. You know that." But his words didn't carry the weight they used to. Janet wasn't buying it. She knew him better than anyone, and she could tell when he was lying. "I'll call the police," she said, her tone now sharp, almost demanding. She didn't care what Mark said. This wasn't just about his betrayal anymore. There was something else, something bigger, something that needed to be uncovered. The police arrived an hour later, their presence turning the already tense atmosphere into something colder, more foreboding. Janet had expected questions. Questions about the affair, about Mark's relationship with the nurse, about their marriage. But what she hadn't expected was the way the officers were looking at her, almost as if she were under suspicion. They had their reasons. They had to ask the right questions. But Janet couldn't help the chill that ran down her spine as they turned their attention to her. Was she involved somehow? Did they think she had something to do with the nurse's death? The officers went through the usual formalities, taking statements from everyone in the room. Mark remained mostly silent, his eyes darting between Janet and the detectives, clearly on edge. He looked less like a man caught in an affair and more like someone who was trying to cover up something much darker. Janet could feel it, the unease that hung in the air like a thick fog. As the detectives questioned her, Janet tried to keep her composure. She answered their questions as best she could, but the one question she couldn't stop asking in her mind was the one that had been haunting her since she first heard about the nurse's death. What was Mark involved in? Had the affair led to something worse, something deadly? She tried to piece together the timeline. If Mark had been seeing the nurse for months, how deep did the relationship go? Had it been purely physical, or was there more to it? And if the nurse had been murdered, what could have been the motive? The affair, jealousy, something else entirely. The more she thought about it, the more questions piled up. The nurse was found dead in her apartment. The cause of death ruled as blunt force trauma. Janet's stomach turned. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a mistake. Someone had intended to hurt her. But who? The police started digging into Mark's movements, checking his alibis, tracking down anyone who might have seen him on the night the nurse died. Janet couldn't shake the feeling that Mark was hiding something bigger than just an affair. She knew him too well, and as much as she hated to admit it, she couldn't rule him out as a suspect. The more the investigation continued, the more Janet realized that the affair wasn't the biggest betrayal here. There was something more, something far more dangerous, that was lurking just beneath the surface. As the days passed, the investigation into the nurse's murder seemed to be making little progress. The police were tight-lipped about their findings, but the air around Janet felt thicker with every passing moment. She couldn't shake the feeling that Mark was hiding something more than just a simple affair. His behavior had changed. He had become more distant, more defensive, almost paranoid. Janet, on the other hand, was starting to feel like she was living in a nightmare. Every phone call, every knock at the door, every strange glance from a neighbor or family member made her heart race. It was as if the entire world was closing in on her. She wasn't just questioning her marriage anymore. She was questioning everything about Mark. Could he have been capable of murder? Could he have killed the nurse to cover up the affair? Or was there something darker at play? One evening, after another long day of unanswered questions and empty promises from Mark, Janet decided to do something she had been avoiding. She went through Mark's things: his phone, his emails, his bank statements, anything that could give her a clue about what was really going on. She had to know. She couldn't just sit around waiting for the truth to come to her. She needed to find it. As she sifted through his belongings, her hands trembling, Janet stumbled upon something that made her blood run cold. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was a lead. In the back of his drawer, tucked between old receipts and a few personal documents, was an envelope with the nurse's name written on it. Her heart skipped a beat. What was this? Why would Mark have something belonging to the nurse? And why was it hidden away? Opening the envelope with shaking hands, Janet found a series of notes, some of which seemed to be written by the nurse herself. They were personal, emotional. The language was intimate, almost like a confession. And then, at the bottom of the last note, there it was, a name Janet didn't recognize. Rachel, I can't lose you. Not now. Not after everything we've been through. It was signed with a strange symbol, something that looked like a code, a mark, maybe a signature. The air in the room grew heavy. Janet felt a cold chill sweep over her, and for the first time she began to realize that Mark's affair might not have been the only secret he was keeping. There was something else, something deeper, buried beneath the surface of their marriage and this murder. Rachel. The nurse's name had popped up in a few conversations, but this felt different. Was Rachel more than just a nurse? Was she involved in something Mark hadn't told her about? Was she a pawn, or was she a player in something much bigger? Her mind raced with possibilities, each one darker than the last. Janet felt like she was drowning in her own confusion, her own doubts. She had always thought she knew her husband. They had built a life together. But now, everything felt like a lie. In the days that followed, Janet kept digging, even though she knew she was getting too close. She contacted Rachel's friends, asking questions, trying to get any information she could about the nurse's life outside of the hospital. But everything she uncovered only seemed to lead to more dead ends. Rachel had no family nearby, no close friends, no one who could give her any answers. The more Janet tried to uncover, the more questions she had, and every time she looked at Mark, she felt the weight of his silence pressing down on her. What had really happened between him and Rachel? And why had the nurse been killed? Janet didn't know it yet, but she was getting closer to something far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. Janet couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, her mind replayed the conversation she had overheard, the mysterious notes she found, and the name Rachel that kept popping up in connection to Mark and the nurse. She had gone through the motions of everyday life, pretending to be normal, pretending that everything was fine, but the truth gnawed at her. There was something bigger at play here, something she hadn't yet uncovered, and the more she thought about it, the more her gut told her it wasn't just an affair that had led to the nurse's murder. The next morning, she decided to follow up on the lead she had found in the envelope. Rachel's name and the strange symbol. Maybe it was a coincidence, but it felt like too much of a connection. Janet called the hospital where Rachel had worked, pretending to be a concerned family member. She needed to know more about this nurse, what kind of person she was, and what her relationship with Mark had really been. The receptionist hesitated, but eventually Janet was given a name: Rachel's partner. They were very close, the receptionist had said, almost nervously. In fact, they had been planning to move in together just before everything happened. A partner. That wasn't something Janet had expected. She had assumed Rachel was just some affair, a fling, someone Mark had used to scratch an itch. But now Janet had to face the reality that Rachel was more than that. This wasn't just about infidelity. This was a tangled web of relationships, secrets, and lies. Janet's mind raced as she processed the new information. Who was Rachel's partner? What role had they played in all of this? And why had Mark hidden this from her? The police still hadn't made any significant progress in the investigation, but Janet couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something. Rachel's death wasn't just a random act of violence, it was personal. The more Janet thought about it, the more it seemed like someone had wanted to silence her. But why? Feeling like she was losing control, Janet reached out to a private investigator, someone she'd never considered hiring before. She needed answers. She couldn't keep digging on her own. Mark wasn't going to give her the truth, and the police were getting nowhere. She needed someone who could get to the bottom of this without the usual red tape. A week later, the investigator came back with a report. "You were right to look deeper," he told Janet, his voice low and serious. "There's more to this than just an affair." The investigator had traced Rachel's partner, a man named Daniel, back to a small town several hours away. It turned out that Daniel wasn't just a partner. He had a criminal history, a past that Mark knew nothing about. In fact, Daniel had been involved in some shady dealings. Was it possible that Rachel had been part of something illegal? Had she been murdered because she knew too much? Or had Mark become tangled in something dangerous? Janet felt a chill run down her spine. The pieces were starting to come together, but she wasn't sure if she was ready to see the full picture. Mark had lied about so many things, about the affair, about Rachel, about his past. But now it seemed like there was an even bigger lie buried deep beneath everything. Janet's mind was spinning, but one thing was clear. Her husband's betrayal was only the tip of the iceberg, and if she wasn't careful, she could end up getting dragged down with him into something far darker than she could ever have imagined. As the days wore on, Janet's sense of unease only grew stronger. The more she uncovered about Rachel's partner, Daniel, the more it felt like everything was spiraling out of control. She had spent hours poring over the investigator's report, reading through the criminal history of Daniel, who had a record for violence and theft. He was involved in a number of shady dealings, illegal business transactions, a few unsolved assaults, and had somehow slipped under the radar, never facing serious consequences. But why was he so connected to Rachel? Why had she kept this part of her life hidden, and why hadn't Mark mentioned him? It didn't take long for Janet to realize that Daniel wasn't just a random person. He was part of something bigger, and that something seemed to be a dangerous underworld that Rachel had likely been involved in without anyone knowing. As Janet thought back to her conversations with Mark, the way he had been so vague when it came to the details of the affair, it all started to make sense. He hadn't been truthful about his relationship with Rachel, and now it seemed like he was hiding more than just the affair. Had he gotten too close to this dangerous world without even realizing it? Janet decided to confront Mark. She couldn't do this alone anymore, and the questions were eating her alive. She needed answers. No more evading, no more deflecting. She had to get to the truth, no matter how painful it might be. That evening, after a long day of research and growing paranoia, Janet waited until Mark got home. When he walked through the door, his face was drawn, tired, like he was carrying a weight that had only been getting heavier. But Janet was done playing games. "Mark," she said, her voice steady but cold, "we need to talk. I know about Daniel." Mark froze. His eyes immediately shifted to the floor. He tried to recover, tried to play it off like he had no idea what she was talking about, but Janet wasn't fooled. "You lied to me," Janet continued, her voice now gaining strength. "You never told me about Rachel's partner. Why didn't you tell me about him? What's going on with you two? What aren't you telling me?" Mark swallowed hard. The nervousness was palpable, but he still wasn't ready to admit anything. "Janet, I swear I didn't know what Rachel was into. I had no idea about Daniel's past. He wasn't part of this. I didn't know anything." Janet didn't believe him. The more he spoke, the more she felt like he was pulling her into his web of lies. "So you didn't know about his criminal record? You didn't know that he's been in and out of jail? You didn't know he had connections to people who don't play by the rules?" Janet's voice was rising now, the anger and frustration of everything finally spilling out. Mark's face grew pale, and for the first time, Janet saw the fear in his eyes. "I didn't know," he repeated, his voice shaking. But there was something in his eyes that told her he wasn't being completely honest. Something wasn't adding up. Janet stepped forward, not backing down. "Then why did Rachel keep all of this a secret? And why are you acting like you don't know anything? You're not telling me the whole story, Mark. What happened between you and her? What did you get involved in?" Mark opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He was trapped. The truth was finally starting to break through, but it wasn't going to be easy. Janet could feel it. Whatever Mark was hiding, it was bigger than just an affair. The pieces were slowly starting to connect, but the picture was far from clear. Before Janet could say anything more, there was a sudden knock at the door. The sound startled both of them. Mark looked at Janet with wide, panicked eyes. The doorbell rang again, more urgently this time. He hesitated for a moment, then walked toward the door, his every movement tight with tension. When he opened it, Janet could barely believe what she saw. Standing on the other side was a police officer, one she hadn't seen before, and a man she didn't recognize. The officer's expression was grave. "We need to speak to you, sir," the officer said, his voice low and firm. "It's about the murder of Rachel. We have some new information." Mark's face drained of color, and Janet's heart pounded. For the first time, she saw genuine fear in his eyes. Whatever was going on, whatever Mark had been hiding, it was about to come to the surface. The officer stepped into the room, his presence chilling, as he motioned for the stranger beside him to follow. Janet's heart raced, but it was Mark's face that truly betrayed the gravity of the situation. He had gone from pale to a sickly shade of gray. Janet didn't need to ask. She could feel it in her bones. The walls were closing in, and the truth was finally making its way to the surface. The officer wasted no time. "We've gathered new evidence in the investigation," he began, his voice calm but firm. "And we need to know if you recognize this man." He gestured to the man standing next to him, a man who looked out of place, almost too clean-cut for the rough past Janet had uncovered in the investigation. The man didn't speak, his expression unreadable, but something about him made Janet feel uneasy, as if this was a connection she hadn't yet made. The officer handed Mark a photograph of the man, and Mark stiffened. His eyes flickered to the photo, then darted away, avoiding the question. Mark opened his mouth to say something, but his voice cracked. He cleared his throat, trying again, but the words didn't come. Janet couldn't hold back any longer. "Who is he, Mark?" she demanded. "Why is the police here? What does he have to do with Rachel's murder?" The officer spoke before Mark could answer. "This man is a known associate of Daniel, Rachel's partner. He's been linked to several illegal activities, including weapons trafficking. He and Daniel have a history together, and we've recently uncovered some disturbing connections to you, Mr. Hayes." The last sentence hit like a bomb. Janet's mind reeled. Connections to Mark. Her gaze snapped back to her husband, and for the first time, she saw the fear in his eyes clearly. It wasn't just guilt over an affair. It was something much deeper, much darker. The pieces she had been slowly putting together were suddenly clicking in place with a force she hadn't anticipated. Her world was crumbling beneath her feet. "What do you mean, connections?" she asked, her voice shaking now. "What are you saying, officer? What kind of connections?" The officer looked at her with a level gaze. "We've traced some of the money Mark transferred to accounts we believe were tied to Rachel and Daniel. He's been involved in financial dealings with them. Money laundering, perhaps, though we're still confirming the details. But what we know for sure is that Rachel's murder was part of a bigger picture. Someone wanted her silenced, and Mark's name has come up more than once." The air in the room felt suffocating. Mark looked like he had been struck by a physical blow. His eyes darted between Janet and the officer, his face drained of all color. The shock on his face was genuine, but Janet wasn't sure if it was the shock of guilt or fear of being exposed. Either way, it was clear that whatever he'd been involved in, it had escalated beyond his control. Janet turned her gaze back to the officer. "What exactly are you implying? Are you saying my husband had something to do with Rachel's death?" The officer hesitated, as if weighing his next words carefully. "We believe that Mark may have been unwittingly involved in a much larger operation. It's possible he didn't fully understand the extent of what he was getting into with Rachel and Daniel. But we can't rule out the possibility that he knew more than he let on. We're still investigating, but right now we need to ask you both to come down to the station for further questioning. It's important we get to the bottom of this." Janet could barely comprehend the words. Mark's face twisted in a mixture of disbelief and fear, but Janet couldn't stop the flood of questions racing through her mind. Had Mark been used, or had he been complicit? Had his affair with Rachel been the catalyst that led to her murder, or was he just caught in a web he didn't understand? As the officer and the man in the suit moved toward the door, Janet caught Mark's eye. For a brief moment she saw something shift in him. A flicker of guilt, maybe, or maybe it was something worse. She couldn't be sure, but one thing was clear. Mark wasn't the man she thought he was. Whatever his involvement was, it was far more sinister than an affair, and now there were more lives at stake. The officer turned back to Mark. "We'll take your statements down at the station, but you're not free to leave until we get more answers." Mark's face was pale, his lips trembling slightly. He tried to speak, but no words came out. Janet stood frozen, not knowing whether to stay or follow, but then the officer nodded at her. "Mrs. Hayes, you're welcome to come with us, but I'd advise you to prepare yourself. This may be harder than you think." The drive to the police station was silent, the air thick with unspoken words. Janet sat in the back seat, trying to make sense of everything that had happened over the past few days. The revelation about Mark's involvement in Rachel's death was still sinking in, and the more she thought about it, the more her head spun. She had always known her husband wasn't perfect. Everyone had their flaws, their secrets, but this was something else entirely. She had never imagined it would go this far. Murder, criminal dealings, a web of lies that now seemed to stretch far beyond her own life, beyond their marriage. Mark was in the front seat, his shoulders hunched, his eyes staring out the window as if he were hoping to disappear. He hadn't said a word since the officer had ordered them into the car. Janet had watched him carefully in the rearview mirror, trying to read him, but his expression was unreadable. The fear on his face had melted into a strange, blank resignation. It was as though the reality of the situation had finally hit him, and now he was just waiting. Waiting for what? For it to be over? For the truth to come out? Janet couldn't tell. When they arrived at the station, the atmosphere was cold and impersonal, the usual bustle of police officers and investigators fading into the background. Janet was led into a small, sterile room and asked to wait. Mark was taken into a separate room, and she could hear the faint murmur of voices through the thin walls. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but what would that accomplish? The more she thought about it, the more she realized that no amount of questions would bring her the closure she desperately wanted. She would have to live with this, whatever this was, for the rest of her life. A few minutes later, the door to her room opened, and the officer who had first spoken to her stepped inside. "Mrs. Hayes, we're going to start with your statement," he said, his tone businesslike, but there was an edge to it, as if he knew that the truth, the real truth, was about to come out. "Before we begin, I need to remind you that everything you say will be recorded." Janet nodded, trying to steady her nerves. Her throat was dry, her hands clammy. "I understand," she said quietly. The officer took a seat across from her, flipping through some papers before looking back at her. "We've made some significant progress in the investigation into Rachel's death. As you know, your husband's involvement is still unclear, but we're starting to piece things together. I'd like to hear your side of the story. What do you know about Rachel's relationship with Mark? And, if you don't mind, what exactly was your relationship with Rachel?" The question hit Janet harder than she expected. What was my relationship with Rachel? She didn't know her. Not really. Rachel had been a name, just a face in the story Mark had kept hidden from her. But now she had to talk about her. Had Rachel known the danger she was in? Had she been aware of the danger Mark had brought into her life? Janet's mind raced. "I don't know much about Rachel," she said slowly, her voice shaking slightly. "I knew about the affair, of course, but not much more. Mark never really told me anything about her. I never met her. But there was always something about him that felt off. I think he was hiding more than just the affair." The officer nodded, scribbling something down on his notepad. "What makes you think that?" Janet hesitated, then spoke with more confidence. "The way he was acting after Rachel's death. The way he reacted when I found out about the affair. It didn't seem like he was just guilty. It seemed like he was afraid. Afraid of something much bigger." The officer paused, his pen hovering over the page. "Afraid of what?" "I don't know yet," Janet replied, her voice quiet. "But whatever it was, it's not just about the affair. It's about money, connections, maybe even more. The more I think about it, the more I feel like Mark got involved in something way over his head. He's in deep with people I don't even understand, and I don't know if he ever realized just how dangerous they were." The officer gave her a sharp look. "You're saying your husband had no idea who he was dealing with?" Janet felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "I don't know. But I don't think he did. And now he's trapped in a situation that's bigger than him. And I'm caught up in it too." The officer leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Mark hasn't been completely forthcoming with us, Mrs. Hayes. He's admitted to the affair, but he's still not giving us the full picture. We believe that he knew more than he's letting on, and we're starting to connect him to some very serious criminal activity. We need your help." If you know anything about his involvement, anything at all, it's important that you tell us now." Janet felt a wave of nausea roll over her. She wanted to help, she wanted to do the right thing, but the truth was too overwhelming. She didn't know if she could trust what she had been told. She didn't know who was lying anymore. She wanted to believe her husband, but every instinct in her told her something darker was at play. "I don't know what to believe anymore," she whispered. "I wish I could give you answers. I really do. But all I know is that Mark isn't the man I thought he was. And whatever he's mixed up in, it's only getting worse." The officer nodded, his expression unreadable. "We'll keep you informed as we continue our investigation. For now, Mrs. Hayes, I suggest you prepare yourself. This is only going to get more complicated from here." As the officer left the room, Janet's head was spinning. She had just uncovered more than she could handle, and the depth of Mark's involvement in something far more sinister than a simple affair was beginning to sink in. What had Mark really gotten himself into? And what did it all mean for her future? The days after the police station felt like a blur, each moment stretching into the next, filled with dread and confusion. Janet couldn't shake the feeling that her life was slipping further out of her control. The more she learned, the less she understood. Mark was still being questioned, and every conversation with the police only seemed to deepen the mystery. The details about his involvement in the illegal activities, the money laundering, and his connection to Rachel's death were becoming clearer, but nothing added up. Nothing made sense. And the deeper she went, the more Janet began to wonder if there was something even darker beneath the surface. Late one night, after another exhausting round of calls with the investigator, Janet found herself staring at the pile of documents on her kitchen table. The financial records, the police reports, the photographs of Rachel and Mark together, none of it made sense anymore. She had seen the signs of betrayal, but she had never imagined this. Had Mark really been this reckless? Was he truly a part of this criminal web, or had he been dragged in unknowingly? Janet was no longer sure where the line between truth and lies lay. Then she got another call. This time, it wasn't from the investigator. It was from Mark's lawyer. Janet's stomach dropped as soon as she saw the number on her phone. The voice on the other end was calm, but the words he spoke were anything but reassuring. "Mrs. Hayes, I need you to come down to the station. There's been a development in the case. Your husband has been charged." Janet's mind went blank. Charged? For what? She could barely breathe, her heart pounding in her chest. The charges were for conspiracy to commit murder, money laundering, and being involved in organized crime. The shock of hearing those words felt like a punch to the gut. How had everything gone so wrong? The lawyer explained that the police had uncovered new evidence connecting Mark to a series of criminal dealings that went far beyond the affair. The money trail led back to shady organizations, people with violent backgrounds, and a network of criminals that Mark had either knowingly or unknowingly become involved with. And Rachel, the nurse, had been caught in the middle of it all. "It seems Rachel was more than just an affair, Mrs. Hayes," the lawyer said softly. "She was a part of something much bigger. Your husband may not have realized the danger he was in, but now we have to face the consequences." Janet could hardly process the information. The man she had married, the father of her children, was now being accused of crimes she never imagined possible. She had always believed that Mark had a weakness for lies, for secrecy, but she never suspected he could be involved in something like this. As the lawyer spoke, Janet felt like she was suffocating, her world turning upside down with each passing word. But even with the charges now in the open, Janet wasn't sure where the truth ended and the lies began. Had Mark been truly innocent, caught up in something he didn't understand? Or had he been a willing participant, hiding his involvement in the criminal world for his own gain? As the weeks passed, The weight of the situation bore down on Janet. The investigation was in full swing now, and every day brought new revelations, none of them good. Mark's involvement in the illegal activities, the money laundering, and the accusations that he had been a part of Rachel's death were being confirmed, piece by piece. But what truly horrified Janet was the growing realization that this web of crime went far deeper than she could ever have imagined. And Mark, for all his denials, was stuck in the center of it all. The media had picked up the story, and every time Janet left the house, she was bombarded with whispers, stares, and judgmental glances. Her neighbors, friends, and even family seemed to be questioning her, as if they knew something she didn't. The pressure was unbearable. How had she missed the signs? How had she ignored the things that now seemed so obvious? The affair, the secrets, the lies, it all pointed back to Mark. One night, as Janet sat in the living room, staring at the half-empty house, her thoughts turned to the children. How would they cope with this? What would they think of their father when they were old enough to understand what he had done? The anger and betrayal she felt toward Mark were intense, but it was the guilt for her children that hit hardest. They didn't deserve this, but it wasn't just the children she was worried about. It was herself. Janet had spent years building a life with Mark, trusting him, loving him. She had believed in him, even when things weren't perfect. And now, everything was crashing down, and she had no idea how to put the pieces back together. Late one evening, as the weight of the situation threatened to crush her, Janet found herself standing outside the house, looking up at the night sky. She needed to get away, even if it was just for a moment. A few minutes of peace. But as she stared up, a figure appeared in the distance, walking toward her through the fog of the night. It was Mark. He looked different, broken, lost, like a shell of the man she had once known. He stopped a few feet away from her, his eyes filled with regret, guilt, and something else she couldn't place. "Janet," he said softly, I never wanted this. I never wanted to hurt you, to drag you into this." Janet shook her head, her voice low but filled with anger. "You don't get to say that. You don't get to act like you didn't know what you were doing. This is all your fault, Mark, and now I have to live with this. We all do." "I didn't know how deep I was in," Mark whispered, his voice breaking. "I didn't know what I was doing, who I was dealing with. I didn't know it would end like this." But Janet wasn't sure she could believe him anymore. The man standing in front of her, the man she had loved, was a stranger now. A man who had lied, betrayed, and become something she couldn't even recognize. For the first time in her life, Janet realized that there was no going back, no fixing this. The truth had been uncovered, and there was no way to undo the damage. Mark had crossed a line, and she was standing on the edge of it, unable to look away. The trial was swift, the evidence overwhelming. Mark was charged with conspiracy to commit murder, money laundering, and his role in Rachel's death. Janet sat through every day of it, each witness, each piece of evidence confirming the man she thought she knew was someone else entirely. The affair was just the beginning. Mark had been deeper into dangerous criminal dealings than she could have ever imagined. When the verdict came, it was no surprise. Guilty on all counts. Mark was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole in 25 years. The moment the judge pronounced the sentence, Janet felt a strange emptiness. The man she had loved was gone. There was no coming back from this, no repairing the broken trust. She had known the truth, but hearing it aloud made it real, final. In the months that followed, Janet focused on rebuilding. For her children, for herself. She had lost the life she had known, but she was determined not to lose herself in the aftermath. Mark was gone, locked away in prison, and Janet was left to pick up the pieces. She didn't know if she'd ever be able to forgive him, but she knew one thing for sure. She was stronger than she ever realized. The past was dark, but it wasn't her future. Janet had learned the hardest lesson of all. Even when everything falls apart, you can still rise again.